It's 12:25 a.m. The Cunard liner RMS Carpathia is mostly blacked out, her saloons darkened, passengers soundly asleep. On the bridge, the few officers on watch brace themselves against the biting cold. Overhead, uncountable millions of stars twinkle and shine. The ocean is still and flat, shining like a mirror. Harold Cottam, 21, is the ship's lone Marconi wireless operator. He's just about to get ready for bed. It's been a long day monitoring the radio traffic mid-Atlantic, but out of habit, before going to sleep, he picks up his headset for one last listen. He's surprised to hear that the brand new luxury liner Titanic, which for the past few hours on end has been sending out passenger messages, has fallen silent. So he sits down at his desk to call up the bigger ship's wireless operator. "Good morning, old man," he taps out on his key. "Do you know that there are dispatches for you at Cape Cod?" The response he receives is chilling. "CQD, CQD, SOS, SOS, CQD, SOS. Come at once. We've struck a berg." Cottam cannot believe what he is hearing. "Should I tell my captain?" he asks, incredulous. "Yes, quick," comes the reply. Carpathia has just found itself caught up in one of the most infamous disasters at sea. Cottam doesn't know it yet, but that brief exchange with Titanic has sparked a race against time that will see the little Cunard Oceanliner push itself to the absolute limit. And soon, they will have their very own brush with the ice. On Thursday, April 11th, 1912, RMS Carpathia, then 10 years old, had pulled away from the Cunard Pier at New York, bound for the Mediterranean. At the time of her launch in 1902 at Swan Hunter Shipyard in Wallsend, England, Carpathia had been one of the larger ships in the Cunard fleet, displacing 8,700 tons. But a decade later, she was vastly outclassed by the line's other great vessels like Lusitania and Mauretania. She still had an important role to play, though. Alongside her similarly sized running mates, she was a modest, comfortable, and practical ship for Cunard, intended to carry vast amounts of cargo across the Atlantic, as well as a small complement of passengers across two classes. On the bridge in April 1912 was veteran skipper Arthur Rostron, who'd started his career at sea nearly 30 years earlier. He joined Cunard as a junior officer on the Umbria, and over the next few years served across the Cunard fleet, being promoted all the time. His first passenger ship command was Pannonia, but then, in January 1912, he was given command of the larger and more refined Carpathia. The ship was rugged and reliable, with a reputation for good seakeeping and little rolling, thanks to her proportionally wide beam. Rostron found himself in command of a happy, reliable and popular combination cargo passenger liner whose career until then had been thankfully uneventful and typical. But for Rostron and the Carpathia, things were about to change. Carpathia had spent 3 quiet days at sea, steaming along on her steady service speed of 14 knots. Aboard her were some notable passengers, including the American painters Emma and Colin Campbell Cooper. Her 300-strong crew was led by 6 officers, which included, in their midst, a promising young man named James Bissett. He was Carpathia's second officer that voyage, and he would one day go on to become Cunard's Commodore, commanding the likes of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth in the Second World War and beyond. But in April 1912, he was merely an aspiring young officer on the bridge of Carpathia as she traversed the Atlantic on a Great Circle course from Sandy Hook to Gibraltar. A Great Circle course is the shortest possible route between 2 points across the curve of the Earth. Carpathia, whose passengers were not in any huge rush, offset her modest speed by sailing a Great Circle course, managing about 336 miles on the 3rd day at sea. By April 14th, the liner had made it about 1,000 miles out of New York and was 3 days into her 10-day crossing. Then, at 9 a.m, something interesting happened. Carpathia received an ice warning. At this early stage of the wireless apparatus's life, the Marconi device largely existed for the benefit of passenger messengers and radio operators who were mostly tech enthusiasts, not unlike today's computer experts, or employees of the Marconi company directly. They were not expected to be on station at all times, and on smaller liners there was usually just one Marconi operator aboard. Ships outside of visual range weren't a danger, and because of this their communique was more of a curiosity than considered a critical piece of information. But one notable exception to this rule were ice warnings, which Marconi operators passed between one another. It wasn't necessarily in their job description, but the fear of icebergs and pack ice at sea, especially in early and mid-spring as glaciers began to melt and carve off, was enough to encourage the swapping of mutually beneficial information. Carpathia's first ice warning on the morning of the 14th of April came from her Cunard fleetmate, Coronia, westward bound from Liverpool to New York. It warned of a large spread of ice, and it was received by Harold Cottam aboard Carpathia, the only wireless operator for the ship. He passed the warning onto the bridge. Captain Rostron had considered the warning. Ice at this time of year was to be expected. "It seems to be a big field," he said. "Keep a sharp lookout. Carry on." As the day proceeded and Second Officer Bissett's 8 to 12 watch gradually came to a close, the air temperature began to drop, chilled by cold currents from the ice field to the north. Carpathia was well south of the ice field, and it was a bright, clear day, so there was no real cause for alarm. After a quiet day at sea, as the sun set and the sea became a flat calm, more ice warnings had arrived from Coronia, Baltic, Californian, and finally, at 9:40 p.m, the Mesaba. Their messages clearly marked out a monstrous field of ice, about 80 miles or 128 kilometers long to the north of Carpathia's position. As Carpathia steams underneath it, the air temperature drops by 10 degrees in less than an hour. By evening, though, another vessel had entered Cottam's wireless range. It was the White Star liner Titanic on her maiden voyage, and her wireless operators were hard at work relaying private passenger correspondence, greetings, and stock reports. Titanic had acknowledged the Mesaba's warning, and Rostron chatted with Bissett on Carpathia's bridge about the ice field. "I suppose that the Titanic will have to slow down," he said, "or steer a more southerly course than the usual track. She'll be late to New York. It's hard luck on her maiden voyage." Rostron, a cautious and experienced captain, assumed that Titanic's commander, Captain Edward John Smith, would avoid the ice field, but he was wrong. On Titanic's bridge, Smith has been lulled into a false sense of security by the spectacular, bizarre sea state and the atmospheric conditions. The night air is chilling, but the sea is a flat calm, like a sheet of glass. There's no moon, which makes it difficult to discern on the horizon where sea ends and sky begins. Smith decided that the clarity of the night will mean that hazards can be spotted in time, and he turns in for bed, maintaining speed and course and telling the watch to wake him up should a haze come up. Then, and only then, would he have to slow down for the night or stop. Titanic presses onward into the night, and far south of them, Carpathia does the same. The passengers have turned in for bed, and Carpathia's saloons and deck lights are mostly extinguished. At about 11 p.m, Cottam had been in Carpathia's wireless office listening to Titanic's stream of passenger messages when the liner, Californian, cut in to announce that they had stopped very near to Titanic's position, surrounded by massive icebergs. Her captain decided it was best to proceed in the morning once the sun had risen. Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips, had blasted back over the airwaves, shut up, I'm busy working," and that was the last of it. On Carpathia, Cottam had hung up his earphones and started to get ready for bed, and Californian's lone wireless man did the same thing. Cottam relayed all he had learnt to Rostron on Carpathia's bridge. He'd picked up signals from around 5 ships in his range, including, just faintly, Titanic's sister Olympic, which he figured to be about 500 or 600 miles away. Rostron thanked him, and Cottam retired to his cabin. The captain gazed out at the dark, ethereal horizon, The conditions were beautiful, but the intense cold and the singular stillness seemed unearthly, almost sinister. Ever the pious man, Rostron said a silent prayer, and then he turned to Second Officer Bissett. "You may sight the Titanic if she bears southward to avoid the ice," he says. "I don't suppose she'll try to run through it when the growlers and bergs are so thick that the Californian has stopped for the night. Wonderful thing, wireless, isn't it?" Bissett agreed, and Rostron went on. "We're in clear water here, but keep your eyes peeled all the same." Bissett nodded, and Rostron, maybe feeling the majestic power of the ocean in that moment, made one final observation. "I'm sorry for Smith of the Titanic," he said. "After all the newspapers boasting she's proved a slow coach on her maiden voyage, and now this ice field will make him lose more time if he steers to the southward around it, as I suppose he will. She must be a wonderful ship, but all their newspaper bragging seems a kind of blasphemy, claiming that she's unsinkable and all that kind of thing." There was a moment of silent agreement, the wind whistling around their heads. Then Rostron simply said, "The night's clear, and I'll turn in." The skipper gave his orders and went to his berth below. Bissett was now senior officer on the bridge. 4 bells were struck, 10 p.m, the usual cry of all's well from the lookout. The watch slipped by, and Bissett, the men on the bridge, and in the crow's nest were doing all their best to keep out the horrendous cold. At midnight, 8 bells were struck, all was well, and Bissett was back to his cabin, glad at last to be out of the freezing chill. Horace Dean, Carpathia's first officer, replaced Bissett for the middle watch. The sky and the sea stretched on for endless eternity, lit only by the eerie, twinkling stars in their countless millions. Then, racing up behind him, Dean hears heavy footsteps, and a breathless Cottam is wide-eyed, panting in front of him. Cottam breathlessly tells Dean the situation, and then races below to the cabin where Captain Rostron is just dozing off. Cottam bursts in with Dean closely following him, and before Rostron can tell him off for the breach in discipline, the wirelessman tells his captain what's going on. "Are you certain?" Rostron asks. "Quite certain," Cottam responds impatiently. "Titanic is sinking." It's now 12:30, and Rostron steps onto the bridge. He has immediately grasped the severity of the situation, and he begins to roar his orders. "Stop her," he says. "Send for the chief engineer. Send for the chief officer and call all the officers. Call all hands on deck and get ready to swing out the boats." Bissett's cabin is just abaft the bridge, and this last order rouses him from his dozing. He rushes out on deck. This is the situation. Titanic reports her position to be about here, but history would prove the given coordinates to be inaccurate by about 25 kilometers or 15 miles west-northwest. At the very least, this inaccurate position would still put Carpathia in sight of the ship's lights as she approached. When Carpathia received the wireless distress call, she was here, about 60 or 70 miles southeast. A handful of other ships are scattered nearby. Parisian, about 50 miles away, has her wireless set turned off for the night. Mount Temple received the distress call, but she's an older, slower ship and she can barely crack 11 or 12 knots. Californian is closest to Titanic, basically right on top of her, but her wireless set has been turned off and she's stopped for the night surrounded by an ice field. Even if she could figure that Titanic was in peril, it would take precious time to put pressure back on her boilers and get her engines turning. To save Titanic's passengers and crew, Rostron knows that he will have to act drastically and even endanger his own ship by sailing at full speed for the site of the sinking, and therefore straight into the very same ice field that Titanic has just encountered. He weighs this all up in his mind, and he decides to act. Carpathia will rise to the challenge. Word is passed around, men rouse sleepy from their bunks, and as they pull on extra layers of warm clothes, Carpathia has already swung her head around, her course altered north 52 west, and her engines thundering full speed ahead. In minutes, all of Carpathia's officers have gathered in the chart room, and Rostron gives them a terse rundown of the situation. He's plotted out Titanic's position and the ice field Clearly, the situation is dire. The Titanic has struck a berg, Rostron says, and she's in distress 58 miles from here on the bearing North 52 West. We'll make our utmost speed in going to her rescue. Call out an extra watch in the engine room and raise every ounce of steam possible. We may reach her in 4 hours. All seamen on deck for sharp lookout and to swing out the boats. We may have to pick up 2,000 or more people. All stewards on duty to prepare blankets, hot coffee, tea, and soup. The doctors to stand by in the dining rooms. All gangway doors to be opened. Boatswain's chairs slung out at each gangway. Pilot ladders over the side. Forward derricks to be rigged and steam put on the winches. And oil to be got ready to quiet the sea if needed. Rockets are to be got ready. Everything must be done as quietly as possible so as not to alarm our own passengers. If the officers had been sleepy before this, they were now standing with intense alertness. Given their assigned tasks, they rushed to their stations, rousing the doctors and stewards quietly but urgently. Across the ship, Carpathia, which had minutes earlier been blacked out and asleep, begins to awaken as lights turn on and people get to work. Within minutes, Carpathia's plodding expansion steam engines are roaring, the engineers working their magic. To maximise their steam pressure and get every bit of speed out of their machines that they can, Rostron calls on his chief engineer. He makes an unprecedented order. Anything that might drain the steam pressure is to be shut off. The heating and the hot water system all cut. He tells the chief to pile every ounce of steam onto the boilers that he can. The group of sailors, led by the boatswain's mate, are oblivious to the drama and they're en route to do some routine maintenance, but Rostron barks out at them to prepare the ship's lifeboats. The sailors are aghast, but Rostron realises their alarm. "It's all right," he says, "we're going to another vessel in distress." Rostron turns to his charts and he can feel his ship vibrating underfoot. Even at full clip, he expects to enter the ice field at 3 a.m, maybe reaching Titanic's position after 4 hours. But those 4 hours will not be easy. The veteran commander knows that on a moonless night like this, the icebergs will be difficult, nearly impossible, to spot. But there's nothing for it. He's conforming to that ages-old tradition of the sea that no distress call should go unheeded. He is a pious man, and he puts his faith in his God that Carpathia wouldn't endure the same fate as Titanic. Carpathia's wild dash through the black night has begun. At 12:45, Cottam messages Titanic, telling them that Carpathia is on the way and would be due to arrive in 4 hours. Phillips on the Titanic simply thanks him for this, and Cottam decides it's best not to jam the airwaves, and he refrains from asking any further questions, listening instead to the radio traffic as the disaster plays out. Around Carpathia, passengers are naturally awakened by the frantic activity, the clunking overhead as lifeboats are removed from their chocks and swung out, and the extra vibration as her engines surge. It creates some sense of alarm for a few, but then the word slowly gets around that Titanic is in danger and Carpathia is racing to her rescue. On the bridge, Captain Rostron knows that his vessel might need to take on Titanic's entire complement of 2,200 passengers and crew. He sends for his surgeon, Dr. Francis McGee. The night is freezing, the water is black, and the pair know that they may have to deal with hundreds of near-frozen, exhausted, and injured survivors. McGee is to transform Carpathia's dining saloons into first aid stations and triage areas. Stimulants and restoratives, the entire first aid supply, are to be dispensed out and made ready. 2 other doctors who speak Hungarian and Italian are each assigned a station and told to make ready for second and third class passengers. Even getting hundreds of people aboard the Cunard ship would be no easy task. She has no accommodation ladder to swing down to water level, so instead survivors will need to clamber up Jacob's ladders, netting, or, if they're unable to climb, be hauled up with pulleys and ropes. Fortunately, Carpathia's gangway doors are enormous, a type of double door which both swing outwards. Carpathia's purser is told to assemble a team to each cover a different gangway and see to the safe loading of survivors from the water. The crew have already swung the huge doors open and begun to rig block and lines with canvas bags to haul people up, as well as cargo nets to act as a kind of rope ladder. The purser and his team will need to triage the survivors, ascertain their class, and then direct them to a different saloon on the ship where they can be seen to by the surgeons. As frantic preparations are made on Carpathia, by 1:25 am, the situation on board Titanic has escalated. Phillips messages that women and children are being put away in the lifeboats, but far below his wireless office, water is already lapping at Titanic's nameplate. The ship does not have much time to live. On board Carpathia, the crew's eyes struggle against the intense frost of the air as they keep their sharp lookout. All of Rostron's orders have been completed and the ship is moving ahead at full speed. Her regular service speed was a modest 14 knots, but it seems likely that her engineers may have been able to squeeze 15 or 16 knots out of the engines. Rostron cannot know for certain whether or not his own ship will fall foul of an iceberg like Titanic had. He puts his faith entirely in good fortune and his crew's keen eyes. He posts additional lookouts to the bow, lower than the bridge and the crow's nest, where they're more likely to see the black mass of an iceberg against the horizon. A dozen pairs of eyes search the inky darkness for ice. Further aft, the crew have turned Carpathia's lounges and smoking rooms into massive dormitories. Masses of blankets have been gathered and piled near the gangways. Hot coffee and soup begin to steam piping hot and they're ready to be served out. It might not seem like much, but a hot meal after hours in the freezing darkness could do a great deal in reviving a survivor. Despite the quiet with which the orders were carried out, curious passengers begin to emerge from their staterooms where they're confronted by informed stewards who can tell them what is happening and keep them out of the way. First-class passenger Lewis Ogden approaches a quartermaster that he's already met and asks what's up. "We're going north like hell," the man says, and he's right. Carpathia is roaring through the water faster than she's ever gone before, but will it be quick enough? At 1:45, Phillips on Titanic sends a chilling message. "Come as quick as possible," he says, engine room filling up to the boilers. Until now, Rostron had expected Titanic to be badly damaged, but he assumed that she would remain afloat, that all of her passengers and crew and her mail and light cargo would need to probably be transferred efficiently to the Carpathia and any other ships which arrived on station. But now he's confronted with a horrifying possibility that there may not be a ship left afloat by the time Carpathia arrives. There's nothing for it but to charge ahead into the night and pray for the best. By 1:45 am, Cottam notices that Titanic's signal strength has become increasingly weaker. The messages become garbled and faint, and then 20 minutes later, at 2:05 am, the wireless communique has stopped entirely, and Titanic is silent. For Carpathia's crew, the lookouts straining their eyes in the darkness, the engineers working at fever pitch in the engine room, that night's activity is intense, and Second Officer Bissett would go on to recall that their nerves were as taut as could possibly be. Would they find Titanic down by the head and passengers away in lifeboats? Would they arrive on station only to see the mighty ship slip beneath the waves? Only time could tell. It seems like an eternity that Carpathia roars onward into the night, until about 2:35 am, Captain Rostron bellows with anxious excitement. "There's his light," he calls. "He must be still afloat." There, far away in the distance, is a faint green dot. Carpathia has done it. It must be Titanic's starboard green running light. The ship alters course for port and bears down on the position. She begins to fire company rockets at 15-minute intervals to show that help is at hand. But at 2:45 am, Bissett is keeping lookout on the starboard bridge wing when he catches sight of stars reflecting off of something directly ahead. He recognises it in an instant. It's a towering mountain of ice. He roars out a warning, and the quartermaster swings Carpathia's helm hard around. She slows in the water and narrowly misses the iceberg which slips by her bow. When Rostron decides he's cleared the berg, he brings his ship up to full speed again, but then another iceberg spotted, and then another one, and another. It's the ice field. Carpathia now begins to zigzag between ever-growing numbers of bergs. It must seem incredible to Rostron that Titanic's master had sailed his ship at full speed into this dense field of ice. Smaller growlers scrape along Carpathia's hull plates. "Hey fellows," calls out one lookout, "look at that polar bear scratching himself with a chunk of ice." There's nervous laughter. At 3:30 am, there's nothing else for it. The ship's speed is reduced from half to slow ahead as the going gets tougher. Now, on the horizon, green flares have been spotted at random intervals, but there's no sight of Titanic's masthead or her navigation lights. Carpathia is right on top of Titanic's given position. She should be visible. And then, at 4 am, a solid green flare is spotted low on the horizon, and as the sky slowly begins to lighten with the early morning, Carpathia inches towards it. The truth is revealed. The green lights are flares lit by survivors in tiny wooden lifeboats. Carpathia has arrived at the scene, but Titanic is nowhere in sight because she is over 2 miles beneath their feet. Rescuing this first lone boat is itself no easy task. Rostron intended to take its occupants on board from his port side, where the Carpathia's bulk would provide shelter from the breeze and the choppy seas, but at the last minute, an iceberg loomed out of the murky light, and Carpathia was still moving slowly ahead, with her engines stopped, carried by her momentum. Rostron puts the helm hard over to starboard and swings his ship around so the little boat arrives on Carpathia's starboard side. Disaster has only narrowly been averted. "Go over the side with 2 quartermasters," he says, "and board her as she comes alongside. Fend her off so that she doesn't bump, and be careful that she doesn't capsize." The wooden boat is only 25 feet long, and to curious onlookers aboard the Oceanliner, it must look like a toy drifting all alone on the vast Atlantic Ocean. It was one of Titanic's emergency cutters, swung out at all times in the event of a man overboard, and huddled on the boat's thwarts are about 18 people, numbed by cold and feeling seasick. On the lifeboat's bow is a metal nameplate reading Titanic. Its occupants, having spent that whole dark, moonless night alone in the middle of the ocean, stare up in bewilderment at the black steel hull and tall red funnel of a Cunard steamship. One passenger in the boat, a woman, cries out hysterically, "The Titanic has gone down with everyone on board." Carpathia's passengers stare wide-eyed at the tiny wooden lifeboats as they begin to appear like specks on the murky early morning horizon. They come slowly closer, drawn to the side of the steamship, some barely occupied but others overloaded deep to their waterline. The preparations made by Carpathia's crew prove remarkably well thought out. The weak and the injured are hoisted aboard. They're comforted by crew and stewards who rush blankets over their shivering bodies and hand them the hot cups of coffee and soup. The rich and the poor spill into the gangways covered in flecks of ice. One man, an officer, makes his way to Carpathia's bridge where he comes face to face with his rescuer, Captain Rostron. "Where is the Titanic?" the captain asks. "Gone," says the officer. "He's Titanic's fourth, Joseph Boxall. She went down at about 2:30. His breaking voice betrays his deep distress. The bridge is stunned into silence. After a minute, Rostron asks, "Were many people left on board when she sank?" Boxall's voice quivers with emotion. "Hundreds and hundreds," he bellows. "Perhaps 1,000, perhaps more." Rostron thanks him and quietly guides him below to get warmed by coffee. On Carpathia's decks and in her saloons, passengers collapse, exhausted and emotionally overcome by horror or even sheer relief. Lewis Ogden, the first-class passenger from Carpathia, tries to hand coffee to a pair of women sitting quietly in the corner. "Go away," one barks. "We've just seen our husbands drown." Rescue work goes on with a deathly quiet, interrupted only by the quiet sobs of separated children, husbands, wives, mothers, and fathers. Carpathia's house flag is lowered to half-mast. In the wireless shack, Harold Cottam comes face to face with an unexpected presence. It's his friend, one of Titanic's wireless operators, Harold Bride. His colleague, Phillips, has been lost in the sinking and his feet are frostbitten, but Bride still insists that he can help in relaying radio traffic. At 8:30 am, some 8 hours since Carpathia had first picked up Titanic's distress calls, the final boat is found and its occupants are brought aboard. Survivors had been watching keenly for their missing friends or loved ones, but now the finality hits home that this is the last lifeboat, and if their friends or loved ones are not aboard, then they're not likely to have made it. Rostron had at first expected to find Titanic still afloat. He was ready to bring 2,200 people aboard his ship, but instead he's found a bedraggled group of wooden lifeboats, and not 2,200 souls, but 705 cold and weary people who haunt Carpathia's decks. He now has a decision to make. Does he remain to trawl for bodies in the water, or should he make for the nearest landfall, Halifax? He could rendezvous with Olympic. She'd be much better suited to caring for the masses of humanity now crowding his ship, but then the realization hits that the sight of Titanic's near-identical sister ship would be more than the shattered survivors could bear. To remain on site and collect hundreds of bodies from the water would have the same effect. There could be no other choice than to turn back around for Titanic's destination port. Bear away from the wreckage, he orders, and Carpathia makes a southwesterly course. It would take until noon for the ship to clear the field of ice that had sent Titanic to the bottom. The Cunard liner is quiet. There's no laughter, only numbed shock. Their crew have achieved something remarkable. They had safely navigated at full speed through a pitch black night surrounded on all sides by ice to arrive in time to rescue the entire complement of Titanic's survivors, but now there could be no celebration, only the quiet, somber voyage to America that 705 people aboard had begun 5 days earlier in excitement and pleasure. Carpathia steams slowly away from the site, icebergs glistening all around her in the early morning sun. It's April 15th, 1912. Carpathia's rescue mission has ended. For the survivors, it had been an horrific night. In the early hours of the morning, Titanic had taken her last dying breath, the myth of the unsinkable ship shattering like glass. In the same spot where there had once been a mighty ocean liner, there was now little left but a smattering of lifeboats floating in a debris field and a haunting, smoky haze left floating on the water's surface. The inky black ocean erupted with splashing and clamouring. The screams of those fighting for their lives echoed in all directions. Titanic's second officer Charles Lightoller recalled that it was an utter nightmare of both sight and sound. Over the following hour, the noise grew more and more faint. Each voice silenced meant another life taken by the cold. The eerie quiet that washed over the lifeboats was only occasionally broken by the cries of a new widow or a child realizing they had lost a parent. The night stretched on like this, with no apparent end in sight, but as dawn broke at last, lights were spotted on the horizon. Carpathia had arrived, having made full steam through the night to reach Titanic's last known position. One by one, the lifeboats and the survivors they held were hauled aboard, and the delirious passengers were offered food, medicine, blankets, and warm clothes. They were given a place to sleep, and most importantly, they had the promise of tomorrow. Onto Carpathia stepped Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He had assumed control of the company after his father's death, and he'd been committed to continuing his lasting legacy. Titanic and her sister ships were Ismay's dream, a passion project he'd overseen for 3 years. As a custom, he would always travel on his ship's first crossings, but then there had come the horror of the sinking. He'd assisted loading lifeboats and getting passengers away before he himself stepped into a boat when the area of the deck he was working in had become unusually empty as passengers tried to escape elsewhere. He had turned his back as the ship took her dying plunge, but one could almost imagine the sounds as Titanic tore herself apart, and Ismay's passengers died by their hundreds would have been just as traumatizing. Ismay, when he arrived on Carpathia, was like a ghost, pale white, shaking, almost unable to speak. Andrews, his close collaborator from the Harland and Wolff shipyard, had been lost. So too Smith, Titanic's commander. Ismay had actually been planning on retiring in December that year. Before joining Titanic, he had written that he was looking forward to good weather, shooting, and a happy retirement, but he also noted, rather ominously, that June 1913 is a far cry, and much may happen between now and then. He could not have known how prophetic these words were. Now confronted in the early morning light by the sight of hundreds of cold, grief-stricken passengers and crew, Ismay was led quietly away and sat alone, looking into nothing. First-class passenger Jack Thayer later recalled that he was staring straight ahead, shaking all over like a leaf. Even when I spoke to him, he paid absolutely no attention. I've never seen a man so completely wrecked. Rostron, Carpathia's concerned commander, described him as mentally very ill at the time. At 8 AM, with the rescue still ongoing, Ismay was sedated by Carpathia's doctor, but he'd written a message to be passed on via wireless to New York. It simply said, "Deeply regret advise you Titanic sank this morning after collision with an iceberg, resulting in serious loss of life." The message was possibly too curt. Rostron and his ship's purser advised Ismay to add further particulars later as a postscript. It wasn't sent right away. In fact, it only reached the New York White Star office 2 days later because it was instead buried under a pile of passenger correspondence as survivors desperately sought to tell their loved ones that they were okay. In New York, there had at first been unease as reports came through that something was wrong with the liner. These days we're accustomed to finding out news within minutes as it breaks, with a constantly refreshing feed available right at our fingertips, but of course, in 1912, news moved much slower, and there was far more opportunity for headlines to become sensationalized or completely garbled. Such was the case as the news began to spread of Titanic's sinking. The first headlines were optimistic, claiming that the Titanic had suffered a collision at sea, but that all passengers were reportedly safe, transferred onto other ships for the remainder of their journey into New York. The public could breathe a sigh of relief. There had been no danger to life, and the greatest concern would be making arrangements for a possible late arrival. These reports led to the understanding that passengers had been transferred off of the damaged Titanic onto the ships Virginian and Parisian, and they were due to arrive in Halifax. A special train was then actually dispatched to pick up survivors who'd be docking in Halifax, but once word spread of a New York arrival, the train turned back around. This was only the beginning of the rampant confusion in the aftermath of the disaster. White Star officials themselves even remained shockingly ignorant of the truth. Philip Franklin, the vice president of the White Star Line and the general manager of the International Mercantile Marine, released a statement after being bombarded with visits and phone calls from concerned families in New York. Assuring the anxious public that there was no cause for concern, he said, "While we are not in direct communication with the Titanic, we're perfectly satisfied that the ship is unsinkable. That no more wireless messages are coming from the ship may be due to atmospheric conditions or something like that. The ship is reported to have gone down several feet by the head. This may be due to water filling the forward compartment, and the ship may go down many feet by the head and still keep afloat for an indefinite period." For many, this statement must have come as a massive relief. If something like that would come right from the shipping company's management, it was easy to believe that there was no real danger. But throughout the following morning, reports began to look more and more bleak. A front-page feature in the New York Times read, "New liner Titanic hits an iceberg, sinking by the bow at midnight. Women put off in lifeboats. Last wireless at 12:27 AM, blurred." Now initially, this much more fatalistic headline was seen as sensationalism, but back in the day of Marconi wireless, news travelled differently because wireless telegraphs weren't transmitting on specific channels for only certain people to hear. Any Marconi wireless message could be picked up at any Marconi wireless station. This meant that the New York Times had actually picked up Titanic's distress calls themselves, translated them, and then got the headline ready to print within hours. They had heard the tragic news from Titanic herself, and it became increasingly clear that the early reports of the situation had been severely understating reality, likely because they themselves had misinterpreted the wireless messages. Once the news was confirmed, and other papers picked up on the story, there could be no more denying it. The world came to a standstill with the printing of one unforgettable headline: "Titanic sinks with great loss of life." The scope of the situation began to drive home, and by midnight, White Star Vice President Franklin was interviewed again, but this time he openly wept. "I thought her unsinkable," he said, "and I based my opinion on the best expert advice. I do not understand it." The question quickly turned to the identities of those lost. Survivor lists were posted, and families flocked to the front steps of the White Star offices in New York and London, desperate to know the whereabouts of their loved ones. These lists, assembled on board Carpathia and then transmitted via Marconi wireless, were, much like early reports of the disaster, absolutely riddled with inaccuracies. Some families were informed that their loved ones had died. The grief hit hard, but then, to their pure amazement, they learned that the reports had proved incorrect. Others, whose loved ones were lost, had been told that they had in fact survived, offering them false hope. It was confusion on all sides, with no answer in sight. The only thing to do was to await the arrival of the rescue ship Carpathia into New York City and let the world see once and for all what remained of the once great Titanic. It would be days before the ship would arrive, and in the meantime the world held its breath as information continued to slowly trickle in. Carpathia had experienced fine weather in her days at sea out of New York, but then, as if to mock her efforts, the Atlantic put on a show of thick fog and heavy rain squalls to delay her return as long as possible. The ship forged ahead with an atmosphere on board that could only be described as funereal. In first class, some of the more illustrious Titanic passengers sat talking over breakfast. It became clear that the survivors would need to pull their own weight and to recognise Rostron and his crew for their incredible gallantry. The leader of this initiative was Margaret Brown, Maggie to her friends, incorrectly recorded in the history books since as Molly Brown. Margaret suggested forming a survivors committee to reward Rostron and see to the welfare of the second and third class passengers on board. The committee would eventually amass over $10,000 total to compensate Carpathia's crew and to reward Rostron with a special gift once they arrived in New York. But arguably, the more important work done by the committee was that to do with survivor relief. It was given its own dedicated subcommittee, speaking with second and third class survivors and taking lists of their basic needs. They also offered counselling for 5 hours a day. Passengers came in their scores to ease the mental burden they carried, but they also raised practical concerns. How could they proceed on to their intended destinations throughout America with no money, many having lost all of their possessions when Titanic sank? Brown and the committee promised to take the matter to Bruce Ismay, and he promised to provide arrangements for connections from New York to wherever they needed to go via train or private car. Others were motivated by all this work. Originally they were stunned by the horrific experience, but then many got to work helping cut and sew new clothes out of blankets. While survivors rested, exhausted and weary, in Carpathia's wireless room the two telegraph operators worked around the clock to send correspondence as best they could. But Carpathia had set to sea with just one operator, Harold Cottam. Remarkably, he was the one who'd worked all night to coordinate Titanic's rescue, and then, the morning of the recovery, he was face to face with an unexpected guest, his friend and Titanic's junior wireless operator, Harold Bride. At just 22 years of age, the maiden voyage of Titanic was to be Bride's 7th round-trip voyage, as part of the Marconi International Marine Company, where he'd just been hired less than a year earlier. Bride had shown a fascination with Marconi's wireless telegraph device starting from a very young age, and at one point he was said to have knocked together his own transmitter and antenna. He had almost died as Titanic went down, stuck beneath an overturned lifeboat and immersed in the freezing water, but upon rescue, Bride reported dutifully to help work in Carpathia's Marconi room. The sheer volume of outgoing telegraphs meant for worried families at home had overwhelmed Cottam, so despite severely frostbitten legs and feet, Bride set about working his way through the seemingly never-ending pile of messages, and the two friends got to work. Titanic survivors tried to get what little rest they could, some wrapped up in clothes fashioned from steamer rugs, numbing the pain with drams of brandy. The weather, meanwhile, had taken a nasty turn. The sea kicked up to a terrible chop and heavy rain pounded the ship, alarming the already traumatised survivors. Titanic passenger Emanita Shelley remembered feeling as though the sea devils were evidently mad at the idea of any of us escaping their clutches. Lawrence Beasley wrote that the Carpathia returned to New York in almost every kind of climactic condition, listing ice fields, freezing rain, moments of brilliant sun, thunder and lightning, cold wind, fog, and thick sea spray. All on board were desperate to get home, but even once they had landed, comfort would still be a long way off. The world that every person on board had left behind when they set off on their journey was not the world they were about to return to. After 3 days at sea, Carpathia slowly steamed into the channel entrance at Lower Bay that would take her into New York. From the sky, countless raindrops fell as if nature itself was shedding a tear for Titanic's survivors. They crowded the railings, stunned into silence by the ghostly sight of the Statue of Liberty as it slipped past them. 172 third-class passengers aboard Carpathia had set out excitedly from their home just 1 week ago on Titanic to see this very sight. The welcome of a new life, the promise of a happier existence, but now more than 700 of their friends, family and shipmates weren't there to see it with them. Nobody knew quite what to expect once the ship had docked, but for now, like their loved ones at home, there was little more to do but wait and wonder what was coming for them once they arrived in America. One passenger on board reported overhearing a conversation between two immigrants. "I've nothing in the world and I've no place to go since my husband is lost," one woman said. "But I'm not afraid. I've always heard that the Americans were the kindest people in the world." Other survivors, in their own varied states of shock and grief, seemed to be processing their experiences in more unexpected ways. Bertha Mulvihill, an Irish third-class passenger, wrote a letter to her sister while on board Carpathia, in what would appear to be a severe state of shock. "Dear Maud," she began, "experience is great. I'm fine and dandy, never better. What time did you hear of the dreadful disaster? I am so glad I was in it. I shall never forget it. Don't think me mad for being so happy to witness the sight. I'm with a jolly crowd in this old ship. I'm awfully happy. Like the night I was born, never felt happier in my life. I have nothing to worry." Sounding more like a cheerful vacationer than the survivor of the world's greatest shipping disaster, Mulvihill's letter was just one example of how trauma, exhaustion, shock, and pure relief had begun to take some kind of toll on Titanic's few survivors. Small steamboats had taken to the water, chartered by journalists eager to be the first ones to catch the scoop firsthand from the survivors of the Titanic disaster. Once the ship was in sight, the blinding lights of flashbulbs lit up her hull, and just like that, the media circus was in full swing. Flares were used for extra lighting by photographers, turning night briefly into day. Journalists called out to passengers on board, desperate to interview anyone who might give them the time of day before the survivors had even disembarked. The most story-hungry among them even attempted to board the ship, either through bribery or brute force. Carpathia's Captain Rostron picked up his megaphone and shouted that anybody who tried it would be shot down. One journalist actually succeeded in his plans, but was immediately apprehended and held by Captain Rostron on the bridge until the ship docked. But despite all these security measures, there would apparently be no escaping predatory journalism. A passenger travelling on board Carpathia was a man by the name of Carlos Hurd. He was a reporter for the St. Louis Dispatch, and as a journalist, he was keen to recognise the opportunity wherever and whenever it appeared. Now, once word had spread that Carpathia was to be acting as a rescue ship for Titanic, Hurd realised he'd just been handed the story of a lifetime. It wouldn't come easy though. Captain Rostron and the ship's crew were fully aware of Hurd's occupation, and were similarly aware of the need for privacy among the traumatised and exhausted survivors. The captain and crew all went to great lengths to ensure that Hurd and his wife Catherine would not be able to use the survivors' tragic situation for their own gain. Their stationery was removed from their cabin, and stewards were ordered to routinely check for any signs that the couple had been compiling notes. But despite all those safeguards, the two had still managed to conduct several interviews and begged fellow passengers for paper and writing utensils along the way. Catherine had kept the notes pinned to the inside of her corset and her petticoat to ensure the work would remain concealed. Meanwhile, in New York, Charles Chapin, editor for the newspaper The New York World, quickly made arrangements to charter a boat to await Carpathia's arrival, and as the ship made her way into the harbour, Hurd took the reports and interviews collected by he and his wife, wrapped them up in a makeshift waterproof package, and hurled it overboard to Chapin. With this, the very first accounts of the Titanic rescue were as good as published. Despite scores of story-hungry journalists, photographers with their incessant flashing cameras, and anxious onlookers all waiting to learn the full story, Carpathia still had one final somber task to attend to before her journey was properly over. The crowd of over 10,000 people looked on in confusion as Carpathia slowly passed right by her own berth at Cunard Pier 54, where she was meant to dock, and instead proceeded to White Star Line's Pier 59. It was here that the 13 of Titanic's lifeboats that had been recovered were unceremoniously offloaded, a grim and eerie reminder of the tragedy that had just taken place. It was a chilling sight. Titanic had set off from Southampton just a week prior, in all her splendour and glory. And now, instead of the beautiful liner sitting at the dock, there were only these tiny wooden boats and the survivors that had managed to escape in them. With this grim task now behind her, Carpathia made her way back to Pier 54 and finally, after enduring the most grueling ordeal of their lives, it was almost time for the Titanic survivors to once again set foot on dry land. By this time, the crowds of onlookers had swelled in size to 30,000 people. Some were friends, family and loved ones of those on board, but others merely wanted to bear witness to history unfolding despite the chill and the heavy rain. A strong police presence had been ordered for crowd control, and 35 ambulances were posted around the pier from each and every hospital in New York City. At 9:30 p.m, Carpathia had finally docked at the Cunard Pier, and the first order of business was for Carpathia's ticketed passengers to make their way off the ship. This was a protective measure put in place by Captain Rostron, who predicted that the press would swarm at the sight of any shell-shocked survivors. For Carpathia's passengers who had set out for the Mediterranean a week earlier, it was probably one of the most surreal experiences of their lives. First-class passengers, Dr. Henry Frauenthal and his wife Clara, were reportedly the first of Titanic survivors to disembark, and as they stepped onto the gangway, a hush fell over the crowd. They were quickly escorted through and into a waiting car, where they were whisked away from the prying eyes of the press. Following the Frauenthals, the other first-class passengers began to file off the ship, in varying stages of exhaustion and dishevelment, most in their pyjamas or makeshift clothing. Many passengers needed to be carried down the gangway due to the extent of their injuries. They were loaded into ambulances and driven off to various hospitals throughout the city for treatment. Second and third class passengers followed, many of whom collapsed into the arms of waiting family members or policemen as the shock finally wore off. Lastly, the few surviving members of Titanic's crew trundled off. Of the 900 men and women who'd signed on to work on board Titanic during the maiden voyage, only 214 had survived. Photographs showed grinning crew met with relief by loved ones, a small glimmer of happiness at an otherwise confronting scene. The Central News reported, some of the scenes at the pier were indescribably affecting. Husbands meeting their rescued wives clung to them and kissed them tenderly. Many women were in a hysterical condition. There was a pathetic procession of sick and injured who were carried on stretchers to hospital. Passengers and crew were met by the city's relief and aid organisations who'd sent their members to distribute food and clothing. The Women's Aid Committee, the Travelers' Aid Society, the Council of Jewish Women, the Salvation Army, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the Red Cross all did their part, providing accommodation for the listless or medical attention for the sick and the injured. The Red Cross began to deal with the sudden influx of donations from across the United States and overseas. Tens of thousands of dollars which poured in and had to be distributed among Titanic's passengers and crew. One crewman in particular became the man of the hour as far as the press was concerned. Harold Bride had been a key witness to the disaster, assisting in the transmission of those crucial wireless distress calls, but he was not among the number of crew who disembarked Titanic that night. Remarkably, the 24-year-old had elected to stay on board Carpathia, which still continued to transmit messages in huge volumes. On the dock, reporters clamoured to get an interview with Titanic's lone wireless man, but it was the New York Times that would strike a deal with none other than the head of the Marconi International Mercantile Marine Communication Company, Guglielmo Marconi himself, to secure Bride's story. Marconi was naturally Bride's hero. He stepped aboard Carpathia that same night alongside New York Times reporter Jim Spears. As the two men entered the wireless room, Bride was so focused on his work that he didn't even look up from the machine. Seeing the opportunity to surprise the young man tapping away at the telegraph, Marconi took a moment to listen into the messages Bride had been sending out, and then, after a pause, he commented, "That's hardly worth sending out now, boy." The words snapped Bride out of his trance, and when he turned to look around, he was face to face with his childhood hero. Marconi extended a warm handshake, thanked Bride for his work, and then offered his condolences on the loss of his colleague, Titanic's chief radio operator Jack Phillips. He then introduced Bride to Spears, the reporter accompanying him, and informed Bride that if he wanted to tell his story, the Times was prepared to pay him the equivalent of $16,000 in today's money. Bride would be a fool to say no to the offer and refuse his hero, so he eagerly agreed, and the next day his story was published in a 5-column front-page piece in the New York Times. His work finally done, Bride was carried bodily off the ship, his feet bandaged tightly. Meanwhile, J. Bruce Ismay had no idea what kind of nightmare he was just about to endure. As news had slowly filtered through of Titanic's loss, Franklin, the New York-based vice president of the White Star Line, had sent a few messages through to Ismay after he'd been revived from his catatonic state. Franklin knew that he and Ismay were in deep trouble because the story was about to get out of control. As Carpathia approached New York, Franklin messaged, "Concise Marconigram of actual accident needed for enlightenment public and ourselves. This is most important." But Ismay's response was buried by a message blackout instituted by Carpathia's Captain Rostron, which ensured that only Marconigrams telling family members their loved ones were safe were being transmitted with any urgency. Franklin's attempts to get ahead of the story had failed, and what messages from Ismay had been transmitted detailed his request for the White Star liner Cedric to be made ready to repatriate Ismay and Titanic's crew as soon as possible. These messages were picked up by the US Navy, and they were handed on to a senator, William Alden Smith, who had other plans for the White Star Line chairman. He waited with a small party of detectives at the New York pier as Carpathia docked. Ismay had issued instructions upon arrival in New York that no international mercantile marine ships were to sail without a sufficient number of lifeboats for every person on board. The rest of the industry quickly followed suit, but as Ismay made preparations to disembark Carpathia, there was a polite knock on his stateroom door, and in stepped Philip Franklin with fresh clothes and some bad news. In barged Senators William Alden Smith and Francis Newlands, Ismay was told he would not be departing home aboard Cedric. Instead, he would need to appear at a hastily convened Senate inquiry beginning the very next morning. Escorted by detectives, Ismay at last left Carpathia, and with Franklin gave his first statement, which began, "In the presence and under the shadow of a catastrophe so overwhelming, my feelings are too deep for expression in words." Ismay was subjected to intense scrutiny by both the media and the American inquiry, and it would not go in his favour. His old nemesis, William Randolph Hearst, ran the nation's largest newspaper chain. He leapt at the opportunity to orchestrate Ismay's downfall. American papers ran sensational headlines, and White Star's chairman was nicknamed J. Brute Ismay for daring to save himself. The damage was done, and his reputation could never recover. As Ismay, Bride, and the other Titanic crew members sat in the Waldorf Astoria answering Senator Smith's questions back out on the open ocean, grim work was being done. The cable-laying ship Mackay Bennett was one of 4 vessels tasked with recovering Titanic's dead. The vessel set out from Halifax and began to search for any signs of the victims, and precious few were found, a little over 330 of the 1,496 people lost. Their personal items were catalogued in detail, but many were buried at sea. The rich and the poor were brought on board and examined. These were Titanic's silent witnesses, those who could never give their testimony. Hundreds still were never found. Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and many, many more. In Belfast, the town that had created Titanic, the outpouring of sorrow from the men who'd actually driven home her iron rivets by hand was deeply moving. At Southampton, where 3/4 of Titanic's crew had called home, there was an intense grief that gripped the population. And at Liverpool, lists of the rescued had to be read from the balconies of the White Star Line office because the crowds were so furious. Still, thanks to Carpathia's efforts, more than 700 people arrived in New York alive to meet their loved ones in America or to return home to Europe and Britain. For Rostron and the crew of Carpathia, it had been a whirlwind week. Their seamanship had been pushed to the absolute limit the night they rushed to Titanic's rescue. They'd almost hit an iceberg themselves. In a story with many perceived villains, Rostron emerged as one of the heroes. Filmed on the decks of his ship, he gave curt interviews and gave little away. But then he was surprised by Margaret Brown. The Survivor Committee's funds had commissioned bronze medallions for his crew commemorating their efforts, and for a spectacular silver cup for their captain. She presented it to Rostron in front of news cameramen, and Rostron was also showered with medals from the US government for his valour. But when the captain later cast his mind back to the night of April 14th, and the following morning, he simply said, "When day broke, I saw the ice I had steamed through during the night. I shuddered, and could only think that some other hand than mine was on that helm during the night." 17-year-old Jack Thayer had tried to comfort Ismay to no avail after Titanic sank, even though he had lost his own father in the sinking. Overwhelmed by the media response, the frantic news cameramen and the volumes of newspaper reports and media sensationalism, Thayer reflected nearly 30 years later on the world the Titanic disaster left in its wake. There was peace and the world had an even tenor to its way, he said. Nothing was revealed in the morning, the trend of which was not known the night before. It seems to me that the disaster about to occur was the event that not only made the world rub its eyes and awake, but woke it with a start, keeping it moving at a rapidly accelerating pace ever since, with less and less peace, satisfaction, and happiness. To my mind, the world of today awoke on April 15th, 1912.